Okay, what's good, everybody? Today is Monday, December 8th, 2025. I'm gonna jump right in. I'm gonna continue the series on one of the biggest deals that I've ever done. I just wrapped up a couple weeks ago. I did essentially walk away from 2 entities and 6 single family home investment properties. Okay, so in the last video, I did a bit of an overview talking about how my business partner and I grew our portfolio. We did a dozen deals in under 4 years together, and we bought and held 7 of those, resold 5 of those, of course. And we had to exit, or at least I chose to exit recently after having fought it for about 2 years. Okay, so for those who've been tracking or have been tuned in, you know I talk about real estate investing, and 3 major pillars in regard to that. And I talk about the capital, the strategy, and the operations, and how if we can combine all 3 of those together effectively, efficiently, productively, then we can have long-term real estate investment success. Okay, and so where I believe I made some mistakes and fumbled the bag a little bit has to deal with the capital aspect. Okay, so I got into some of that on the last video, and in today's session, I want to kind of highlight some of the key things that happen, or maybe some of the main lessons that I learned along the way, so that you might be able to, of course, learn from that. Hopefully, you know, this education and inspiration will encourage you, okay? And this might be a bit of a cautionary tale for some of you as well, okay? With it being the end of the year 2025, you know, rounding out the year, things are quite a bit different than they were 6 months ago, let alone, you know, 4, 5, 6 years ago when I first started working with my business partner who I mentioned before. Okay, and so one of the biggest things on the list of, you know, items I wanted to go over today was how I essentially walked away and did so for no money, and basically a bit of a loss. Okay, so for those who are, you know, in the thick of it, or those who are new to the game, and even some of those of you out there who are wanting to get in, some things, you know, you're gonna have to think about is how, you know, you're gonna operate, and how hopefully you can pay yourself as part of this process, however that looks. And it depends on, you know, how you're set up and what you're bringing to the table and what your role is. Okay, so for me, in my situation, my role was essentially boots on the ground. I mean, overseeing the renovation projects, working closely with the contractors and a property manager when need be, and then facilitating the transactions, more or less operating the business on the ground, coordinating with the attorneys when need be, the tax advisor, the CPA, residents, tenants, title companies, appraisers, inspectors, and the list goes on. So there's quite a bit that went into my particular role. And depending on where you're at, if you're a capital investor, which I would consider my business partner to be, then his role, or your role, if you're a capital investor, may be more passive. It may be more limited. So again, it really is a case by case type of thing. But, you know, if you're going to be the operator, if you're going to be boots on the ground running the show, then it's good to get yourself paid somehow, some way. Okay, so how I initially started with this enterprise or venture that we took on, instead of me having to come out of pocket for the investments, what we agreed on was for me to leave the commissions in the deal. So as I was doing the deals, negotiating, transacting on the investments, instead of paying myself a commission for doing that, I left that in the deal or in the investments. So that was part of my investment. Some people refer to it as sweat equity. Okay, so that was my role. And a lot happened over a 6-year period because we started rocking together, me and this particular investment partner. I have multiple partners to this day, but me and this particular investor started rocking together toward the end of 2019. And we finally kind of got to a point this year where, you know, I fought it for a while trying to figure out how we could salvage the portfolio and exit more efficiently. But long story short, on that first point, I walked away with no money. And I looked at some of my notes because we were tracking how much each of us had invested into the portfolio. And, you know, out of pocket, I had invested about $8,000, okay? If you factor in that $8,000 along with the commissions that I left in the portfolio or in those deals, okay, it came out to about $26,000. Now, mind you, we did pay ourselves along the way, okay, because I quickly realized after the second year that, hey, there's a lot that goes into this process. And if I have to wait until the very end of every single transaction to get paid, that could be frustrating and annoying. And it's just human nature. It can lead to some resentment. And it can, in my case, I was very close on the edge of exhaustion and burnout. Okay, so I mentioned the $8,000 out of pocket. I mentioned the total of $26,000, essentially, that I had invested. That does not include necessarily the time and energy and so forth. But I also mentioned that I got myself paid throughout the process. So factoring that into the mix, I may have lost out on over $20,000. Okay, so, and why did I walk away? Why did we exit, right? And this is the challenge, you know, for most investors, and it's somewhat challenging for me to even want to talk about it. But I want people to know, like, the reality of real estate investing. Okay, so part of the reason that I chose to walk away, or part of the reason we were in a bit of a bind, has to deal with the capital aspect, as I mentioned before. Okay, so we were doing a number of deals. We were trying to grow and take things to the next level. And of course, we needed additional capital to be able to do that. And I don't want to get too carried away because there's a number of points that I want to get through. But it was the use of the short-term debt, okay, from different private individuals, private investors that we knew who were willing to loan us money in second lien position, okay, some of which was secured, some of which was, you know, not documented and unsecured, okay? So check out the past videos. Everybody's got to do your own research, okay, and figure out, you know, I've really been imploring and encouraging more of y'all to look at the capital piece because it's an absolute game changer. Okay, so it got to the point, all right, where we had about 6 figures worth of second lien position debt, okay, some of which was unsecured, some of which was secured, and we had a relatively short amount of time to pay that off. Well, we ran out of time, okay, and so we were able to exit one of those 7, okay, I mentioned before, we held 7 of those investment properties, 7 of the 12 we held. We were able to exit one of those to get part of the second lien position debt handled, but we ran out of time and options before we could settle the rest. And so my business partner brought in an associate of his to take care of the remaining second lien position debt that had a balloon on it. It was interest only and it was short term. So that's where the caution and the learning happened, okay? So I'm out of the picture at this point. By the way, I can buy back in at some point in the future. And for those of you who are listening, these are performing assets. These are performing notes. So someone out there who's listening, you might be interested. Okay, so reach out to me, check out the last video. You know, if you're seeing this video and you want to learn more about purchasing notes, okay, so we do seller financing. And when we do seller financing, that is a note, it's a paper asset that gets created. So if you, I got to stay on track, but there's an opportunity to get back in. All right. So the next point I wanted to talk about is actually part, of seller financing. Okay. Selling or exiting from a seller finance deal can be very challenging. Okay. It's not like you're just selling a house that you just rehabbed and you put on the open market. Okay. It's not like you are selling a rental property that you've held for 2 or 3 or 5 years, right? And you can exit relatively smoothly. When you're dealing with a note or a paper asset or a seller finance deal, for whatever reasons, it's more challenging to exit from that investment or from that asset. Okay. And I know I've mentioned it on some previous videos on how to exit from a seller finance transaction. So that's another key part where we got a little caught up, or we had our hands tied a little bit, because if we had held those 7 investment properties as rentals, they definitely would have been easier to exit or resell, but the numbers and the profits or the cash flow would have been quite a bit different. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And that leads me to my next point, right? If we had gone the rental route, okay, let's say we, did as we did, using hard money, short-term debt, rehab, refinancing, right? If we had, just as we did, went that route, and instead of doing seller financing, we did the rentals, okay, what would have been the difference? Okay, so with just a quick recap, with seller financing, we usually get a down payment or some type of upfront money. Okay, the residents pay us each month. Okay, we take care of the taxes and the insurance. The residents are responsible for the upkeep and the maintenance of the property. So that frees us up as investors. Okay, so the residents are taking care of the property management. Okay, and their escrow payment covers, part of, their monthly payment is the escrow. That covers what we would have paid out of pocket for the taxes and insurance. So our returns are different, our vacancy rate is different, and our cash flow is different with seller financing, because we're not paying 8 to 12 or 15% for property management, and we're not paying 5 to 10 or maybe 15% for maintenance. Okay, so that's a plug right there for seller financing. Okay, so tap in if you want to know more on that. Check out the past videos, and as I take a deeper dive into seller financing as well. Okay, so that's what we did. We did seller financing. But if we had done rentals, if we had done, let's say, long-term rentals, how might that have been different? Okay, because I mentioned before, we would have, I believe, been able to exit and resell those properties easier as rentals, but the numbers and the costs would have been different. Okay, so if we were to have kept these properties as long-term rentals, let's say, we would have been able to get, first month's rent deposit. Okay, cool, right? That's already taking a hit, right? Then along the way, we would have had to, at some point, come out of pocket for some type of maintenance or management. Even if I manage my own rentals, which I do, okay, or have done, even then, there's going to be those costs that come up, okay? And then with the rental, after maybe a year or two or less, or maybe longer, there's a good chance that we would have turnover, meaning that the tenants would move out. We'd have to deal with a vacant unit, clean out, trash out, clean up, upgrades, possibly on the vacant unit. Then you have the lag period while we're doing all that, then getting the next tenant in there. So the cost of rentals, the whole point here, the cost of rentals and the operational output, what it looks like, you know, physically, energetically, managing notes, okay, versus managing, okay, rentals. Okay, so you got to think about that, right? So that's another key part. We would have probably been able to exit more efficiently, but we may have not made any money, or maybe we might have lost money, okay? Because you're talking, and it's hard to say. Like, I love, you know, running numbers and talking about what investments could look like, and we could do spreadsheets till we're blue in the face. But until you get in the mix, and until you do that deal, and until you hold that investment, and then you get with your tax advisor, your CPA, and you run the numbers, that's the reality of it, okay? Which most people aren't really talking about. We're talking about what we could do, or we got under contract and we sold it and made a profit. Well, is that revenue? Is that really net profits? Is it cash flow? How does that really look? So that's the part where investors are freaking lost, I think, because it takes time to sort through this stuff. All right. So that's how things might have been different if we had kept those properties as rentals. We may have lost money or we may have gotten lucky and broke even and made a little bit of money, but it would have been, we would have needed more money. A lot of investors, you know, talk about doing deals with no money, and I get that we could use other people's money, but if you're doing fix and flip and you're doing traditional rentals of some sort, you're going to need even more capital than you think you'll need. Okay. If you're doing seller financing, you have, and you're able to hold for the long run, you have a fighting chance of success. The challenge is being able to hold on and to use the right type of capital in the debt to be able to support your investment portfolio, which we did not do, which is why I'm talking to y'all now about this. Okay. So last point I'll get into is, what would I have done different, or what could, you know, I do different in the future? That's a good question. You know, I don't want to say that I have regrets or, you know, made a bunch of mistakes or whatever, because I probably knew what I knew at the time, right? If I would have done it all over again, would I do it all over again today, knowing what I know now? It's a good question. I would switch some things up. I kind of got into it on the last video, how I would have done things a little bit different. I would have paid myself better and more efficiently throughout the process. That's one big thing. I would have sourced more capital on the front end instead of waiting to the last minute, you know, to sort it out on the back end, or as the clock's, you know, winding down or whatever. And then I probably would have adjusted, or I, you know, definitely would have adjusted a little bit different with the changing economy, interest rates going up, feeling the effects of inflation and changes in the regulation for real estate, and the list goes on. I would have switched up the strategy a little bit. Okay. So not to say that I wouldn't have, you know, done the BRRRR strategy, or for those that don't know, rehab, use short-term debt, rehab and refi. Now I know the reality of it. There's a lot of work that goes into that process. B, okay, you're going to go over budget and pass the deadline on virtually every single project. Okay. C, right, getting yourself compensated is key on that. And then now, having gone through those experiences and ran the numbers a few different ways, I now know how to better communicate that with my client and or my partner. So that's a key thing too, that's a big thing, is being able to, and this is something that also does not get talked about in the real estate community, okay, and in the business world, I guess, as well, is managing expectations. Okay, knowing what I know now, I would have spent a little bit more time, maybe not a whole lot, but a little bit more time consulting, advising, communicating with my client or my business partner, letting them know everything that it's going to take to get through that process. It doesn't have to be a dissertation, right? But a better overview of how this shit actually works. Not how they want it to work, not how I think it will work, but how it actually works. Then I can determine if I want to proceed with that partner or client, because if they're iffy about it, right? Hindsight's always 20/20. Looking back, I probably should have ended it 2 years prior with that business partner, because things got kind of toxic. I'm not saying that I'm toxic or he's toxic, but the situation got toxic. Okay, so that will be a segue into the next video, where I get into a follow-up of, selling 2 companies or walking away from 2 companies and 6 properties that are worth over $1.2 million that are cash flowing $300 a month net each one. Okay, I'm going to get into on a future video talking about that, and also some of the mindset and the psychology and the emotional state. I realize I'm a lot more emotionally aware, okay, about when things may not set well, or if I'm iffy about it, or if my client or my partner, capital investor, lender, if somebody's iffy about it, is it wise to proceed anyway? Or should we pull back and listen to our intuition and let that guide us about how we could proceed? Because, something I talk about or have mentioned before is we get in the groove of things, and there's a high, or it's almost addictive to be able to do a deal. Even if it's not even a great deal. If you just close a deal and you assign it and you make $500, that's kind of a rush. And as you are doing more of that, and you get into the different aspects, rehabbing, refinancing, the management, the operations, and sorting out the capital and the strategy and so forth, it's easy to get carried away, and you want to continue your progress. And sometimes we sacrifice, we get our ego involved, and we sacrifice wanting to just do more deals so we can post on social media, or wanting to grow the portfolio at a certain pace, right? And we start to slip a little bit on how we move and how we operate. And so again, part of that has to deal with our psychology and emotions, and how we're thinking about real estate, and how we're feeling as we go through the process, communicating with whoever is involved. Because again, the experience was great, had a lot of fun. I'm still a little butthurt because the plan was to hold these investments. But, looking back, I would have pumped the brakes on maybe the last 2 or 3 deals that I did, because at that point it was early 2023. And as I mentioned on the last video, we went from, 5.25% interest rates, right, on 30-year fixed rate mortgages to over 8% interest rates for investor financing. And that happened all within, in eight, less than a year, all that happened. And so we had to switch gears. And by that time we were already kind of in the middle of those next few deals. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up right there. Appreciate you tuning in. It's Luther Wilson III, real estate extraordinaire, Upside Property Services, Kansas City real estate all day long. And feel free to reach out if you're a capital investor, if you're a real estate practitioner, if you're looking to do your first deal, if you want to make some moves here in the Kansas City market. You know how to reach me. Have a blessed day. Peace, y'all.